Now that you have watched the video related to the ROS system, let's go to page 59 of your course pack, and we will fill in the hormone charts. Okay, page 59. So we're going to be learning a lot of hormones between now and the end of the course, and every time we learn a hormone, we're going to put it in a chart like this to specify where it's secreted from, what trigger the release of the hormone, as well as the effects of the hormone on various targets. So when you watch the video on the RAS system, there was aldosterone. Okay, so aldosterone, the location of secretion would be the adrenal gland. Okay, so adrenal cortex, the particularly specifically the outside of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys, and there is the adrenal cortex outside, and there is the adrenal medulla. So the aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex, the outside. The stimulus would be the trigger for releasing the aldosterone. So in the ROS video, there's low blood pressure that will trigger the release of renin, which then leads to the release of angiotensin, which then gets converted into angiotensin 2. Then you would release the aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. But for simplicity's sake, right, the ultimate stimulus for the release of aldosterone is basically low blood pressure, right? And again, this could be caused by things like blood loss, right, dehydration, right? These are common causes of low blood pressure. Once you release aldosterone, then it's going to have the following effects on the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Okay, so affects the distal tubule and collecting duct. Right, so number one, it will increase NaCl absorption. Right, so this means it will take the NaCl from the filtrate in the DT and CD and take it back into your blood. And because you absorb NaCl, water is going to follow, so increase water absorption. Right, this happens through osmosis. And then, because you have more water in the blood, that will increase blood volume, and then that will result in increase in blood pressure. So typically speaking, most of the hormones would have some kind of effect that is opposite to its trigger. Right? So in this case, the trigger is low blood pressure. That will lead to a series of events that results in increased blood pressure. So something like this, we call it a negative feedback. We're gonna do ADH later on. Now let's skip to ANH, right? So ANH and aldosterone, right? These two kind of function against each other, right? So we call them antagonistic hormones. Right, so there are three pairs of antagonistic hormones that we're going to learn. Typically, they act against each other, have opposite effects to maintain some kind of homeostasis. In this case, the homeostasis would be blood pressure. Okay, so this ANH, this atrial natriuretic hormone, the location of secretion would be the atrium, right? Atrium of the heart. And the trigger for releasing ANH would be high blood pressure. High blood pressure, right? The effects would be several effects. So number one, it will inhibit the release of renin, right, and aldosterone. Right? So if you don't have renin, then you're not going to be able to trigger the release of the angiotensinogen, right? Basically, you shut down the RAS system by inhibiting the release of renin. By inhibiting aldosterone, you will not be able to increase the blood pressure, right? Which is what we want, right? We are having high blood pressure, we want to bring it down. So by inhibiting aldosterone, that's a good thing. Now you might be wondering, well, isn't it redundant? Because if you inhibit renin, then technically you won't have aldosterone coming out. It turns out aldosterone can be triggered through another pathway other than RAS. So even if you shut down renin, there might still be some aldosterone, hovering around in your bloodstream. So that's why we want to inhibit those as well. And then what's going to happen is it's going to increase NaCl secretion this time. Secretion at distal tubule and collecting duct, right? And that means you're going to be taking it from the blood and putting it into the urine now, right? Because your blood pressure is too high, you want to get rid of NaCl from your blood. That would increase H2O secretion, right? Reduce blood volume, which would result in reduce in blood pressure. Okay, so you're going to be peeing more NaCl, right? That's why this one is called natriuretic. Right? Natri means basically sodium, right? Natrium, right? Na, and you're going to have more sodium in your urine. Okay, so there you have it. These are the two antagonistic hormones that you need to maintain normal blood pressure. So you can read through these slides yourself, right? It's basically everything I talked about in the video and in the RAS video. Now we're gonna move on to talking about another hormone, which is ADH. So ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone, right? So a diuretic is something that makes you go to bathroom frequently, makes you pee a lot. An anti-diuretic means you do not pee a lot. Right? So this hormone is something that you would release when you want to conserve water. Right? So typically speaking, the distal tubule and collecting duct is not going to absorb water. It will only do that if your system has ADH in it. Okay, so ADH is made in the hypothalamus, but then it's stored in the posterior pituitary gland. So let me explain that a little bit more for you on this in this diagram. You might remember in the nervous system unit, right? That you have the hypothalamus here, hypothalamus. Okay, and then below it is your pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. All right, so your pituitary gland is actually separated into anterior pituitary gland, right, as well as the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so we'll learn more about this in lecture 12, but for now, in the context of what we're talking about, you should know that there are some neurons in the hypothalamus that extends their axon all the way down to the posterior pituitary like this. Okay, so what they do is they actually will make some hormones. They will make some hormones and then they will transport it down their axon and store it in the posterior pituitary. So there are two such hormones that are made in the hypothalamus but stored and released from the posterior pituitary gland, right? And ADH is one of them. Okay, so you're going to make these anti-diuretic hormone in the hypothalamus. You will store them in vesicles in the posterior pituitary, and when the trigger comes, right, you will send some signals, some action potentials down the axon, and the ADH will be released from the posterior pituitary gland, much like you release neurotransmitters. Okay. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here. When a person is dehydrated, right, when you don't have enough water in your system, then your blood concentration goes up, right? And when the blood concentration goes up, it will cause cells to lose water. Remember, water always goes towards the side that is more concentrated, right? So as the cells loses water, the hypothalamus will shrink, right? By shrinking the hypothalamus, that sends the signal down to the posterior pituitary gland that will eventually trigger the release of ADH. Okay. In addition, the hypothalamus will create a thirsty sensation because if your blood concentration is too high and you're dehydrated, the things that makes sense to do is to drink some water, right? So this is a flow chart, right, that shows you what happens, right? Starting at the trigger of high blood osmotic pressure, right? So this is dehydration. Now you probably are thinking, right? Well, dehydration was also the trigger to activate ROS, right? And you're absolutely right, right? A lot of these hormonal pathways do not operate independently. They sometimes happen simultaneously to bring about homeostasis. Right? So by increasing the blood concentration, you would cause the hypothalamic cell to shrink, which then cause you to release the ADH. And ADH will travel through your bloodstream all the way to the kidneys, where you will increase the absorption of water. So to show this in a better way, you can look at the next slide. Okay, on the left here, this is the absence of ADH. So when you don't have ADH in your system, so you've been drinking your waters, you're not dehydrated, there's no need to conserve the water, then you don't release ADH, right? So what happens when you don't have ADH? Well, these dots represent the concentration of your urine, right? So you can see as you go down the loop of Henle, the concentration of the filtrate goes up, right? This shouldn't be surprising. We learned it before, right? In another video, right? The descending limb is going to absorb the water from the filtrate, so it gets very concentrated, and it's the most concentrated at the bottom. However, on the way up, you're going to be absorbing NaCl, causing it to be diluted. Once again, so typically without ADH, you will just be producing large volume of diluted urine most of the time. However, if you are dehydrated, okay, you didn't drink much water, you're sweating a lot, right, you're exercising, then you will need some ADH, right? So in the presence of ADH, right, you will continue to absorb more water at the distal tubule and collecting duct, resulting in very small volume of concentrated urine, right? So without ADH, large volume of diluted urine, right, light color urine, and in the presence of ADH, you will have small volume of concentrated urine. So typically, when you're sleeping at night, right, and then when you wake up in the morning, if I take a blood sample, do you expect the ADH to be high or low? Right. So pause the video, think about it. Right. When you wake up in the morning, right, is the ADH in your blood high or low? The correct answer is high ADH, right? Because throughout the night we're not actually drinking anything, right? You shouldn't be drinking anything while you're sleeping, of course, and so therefore you are kind of dehydrated. Your body's trying to conserve the water for you, right? As such, you're gonna have high ADH in the body, and it makes sense, right? We don't want to be waking up, every other hour to go to the bathroom, right? We don't want to be producing urine as we sleep, and so. Or like we don't want to be producing too much urine as we sleep, and so it makes sense for us to have that ADH. Okay, some people have the cells in the hypothalamus that's responsible for producing the ADH. For some people, they are damaged or destroyed, and as a result, it will cause them to have what's called diabetes insipidus. And what that does is they basically don't have ADH to regulate water reabsorption, and they basically have very, very high urine output. In some extreme cases, they produce as much as 20 liters of diluted urine each day, right? And that creates a very strong thirsty sensation. And finally, the last kind of role in maintaining homeostasis in terms of urinary system is this buffering capacity. Basically, without going into too much detail, you just have to know that the kidney can adjust how much H plus and OH minus is in your blood by either conserving HCO3 as we talked about earlier, or by getting rid of the H plus. If you have too much acid in your system, we call that acidosis. So in that situation, it makes sense for your kidney to kind of get rid of the extra H plus. And on the other hand, if you have too much OH minus, too much alkalosis, then you would want to conserve these H pluses to neutralize the OH. So there won't be any questions on the buffers, so you don't have to worry about that too much. And this is a more detailed description of what I've talked about. So we will actually skip the kidney disease. There will be no questions on the kidney diseases on the quiz. So everything in the urinary system will be on your quiz number 3, and that's it for lecture 9. You should probably fill in the workbook yourself, right? With all the fill in the blanks and all the other questions. I wouldn't have time to go through it with you remotely, but if you get stuck on a particular question, you don't know what the answer is, of course, feel free to email me.